Hello, this is Broadening Your Horizons, and I want to talk to you about MH17, Malaysian airplane crash in Ukraine. Normally I don't really cover these types of disasters, acts of terrorism, mainly because it's very hard to digest the facts as soon as the information comes out. But here, to me it's very clear that we need to start questioning this event because there are some abnormalities in this throughout this. And you see the plane wreckage is very diverse, very I can't think of a word. It's you have certain objects which seem to be unscathed in the throughout the wreckage, and a lot of the actual wreckage of the plane seems to be broken into many pieces. However, I can't find a picture, but there's a picture of a wing I found somewhere, and that wing being broken off and just placed, looks like so it's just been placed on the ground. Now apparently most of the fuel gets placed within the actual wing itself, probably partly to balance it, but also probably another part is to use that part of the plane. That's what I've heard. I'm not sure whether that's correct, but if that's correct, when the plane lands, when the plane lands, it should explode immediately, and the whole plane will be up in flames. But that's not the case with this flight. It seems that one part of the wing has managed to just is just lying on the ground without any true damage to it. Also, there's huge parts of the plane which are just on the floor without even a scratch on it, without any burnt marks, without any singe marks, and this is very interesting in terms of using all the evidence, all the pictures. So I want to go into history and look at various instances, well, 3 instances in history that are very similar to this instance of a plane going down. One of them is Iran Air Flight 6555, happened on 3rd of July 1988. So this flight, there were pretty much just as many people who died in this flight as there was in the other flight. The only difference is that the US military that admitted to be taking it down, and most of the airliner was Iranian, and most of the people on the plane were Iranian. And the US military thought at the time, apparently, that it was a terrorist plot. They thought it was an act of, say, war. It was an act of violence. They thought the plane was being used at the time for a different purpose. Now, whether the facts of the actual incidents is, well, I want to focus on the response of the US government, the response at the time of, whether it was justified. And the US government at the time, you had Reagan in power and George H.W. Bush as Vice President of the United States. And George H.W. Bush said, I will never apologise for the United States. I don't care what the facts are. I will not apologise. I'm not an apologise for America kind of guy. So he doesn't care why the US Navy took down this plane. He doesn't care what the facts are. He just said, I'm not going to apologise for anything that the United States have done. So this was back in the 2nd of August 1988. And also at the time you had Reagan. He said they were justified to take such action, and they said that our interests are for peace within that region, and then so now you can see where the peace have gone in terms of what's happened from then until now. You can see how much peace they have given to the Middle Eastern and region. So I urge you to look further into this incident and look into the slant of the fact that they were justified at the time to take such action and killing civilians. Because you've got to remember that they thought this was an enemy plane, and they thought that it was going to cause a lot of damage. So at the time they didn't know what type of plane it was. They couldn't see what type of plane it was, and they didn't decide to just find out what plane it was. They just decided to take it down. So moving on quickly. So these are very heavily related. This happened a few months later in Scotland. It's the famous Lockerbie bombings, and it was apparently perpetrated by the Libyan, not necessarily government. It was perpetrated by Libyan people apparently, but then, sorry, I'll just search up log. So here we are. This is the article that I saw. We just let it roll up. So yeah, it was done by the Iranian government. It's not loading up. Here we are. So bombing was work of Iran, not Libya. So this says, and this report was only done at the beginning of this year in March, and this is according to a former spy. So at the time, we didn't feel it was relevant for the public to know that this could have been the case. So why was that? So this has a direct correlation to this other flight, because they took down a plane. Apparently, so this is all apparent because the Americans took down the Iran plane, and later on, apparently, the Iranians took down a civilian plane over the UK. So this is very interesting because at the time you had this unprecedented slant towards the perpetrators of who took down this plane, whereas when a few months beforehand the US government decided to put their hands up and just say yes, it's fine, it's okay, yeah, it's in the interests of the American people. We want to keep the public safe, the region safe, and that everything needs to be safe. So don't worry, it's in everyone's interests. And then you have this one. It's TWA Flight 800, and this was actually over American soil. It was on the 17th of July 1996. And this is very interesting event, because it happened, this was exactly 17 years before the incidents that took place on the 17th of July 2014. That is the Malaysian airline flight. So exactly 17 years ago, this took place. TWA Flight 800. And this, apparently, the official story of this, so the official story of this is that the fuel exploded within the plane, and the plane basically exploded on the ground, or in the air, and then went on the ground. And so you can look at this Wikipedia, and just to give you a warning that Wikipedia is more of a mainstream view of things. So if you want to see any alternative viewpoints, what they'll do is have a link here, and they'll dub it as a conspiracy theory. So this is a different view, different opinion, but it's a conspiracy because it's a different viewpoint to what the government are saying to people. It's a different reason why it happened. So the conspiracy theory is that maybe a rocket flew into it, or it was taken down. So if it was taken down, then maybe something went wrong. We can conjecture as much as we like, but this isn't the main focus of today's talk. The main focus is the reasons behind MH17 went down. So if I go here, MH17. Okay, so what I found, which was interesting, MH17 went down on the 17th of July 2014, exactly 17 years near that the instance, 17th of July 1989 took place. So if we look over here, this is flight fleets. The date that the first flight took off was 17th of July. Exactly 17 years old, the plane. Then a year later, that plane took its first flight, exactly a year to the day, in 1998, for its first commercial airline flight. So why is it that its first flight was the 17th of July, exactly 17 years before the flight took, exactly 17 years before it crashed, and a year later to the day, so 16 years before it crashed, exactly to the day, it took its first commercial airline flight. Now, I find that rather interesting, all these synchronicities, and it actually, with the September 11th attacks, you had a lot of the number 11s prevalent within the whole structure of 9/11. So you kind of have this number 17 prevalent on this flight, because also, sorry, I forgot to mention that it's called flight MH17. So I don't know why that is the case. I don't think that's necessarily a conspiracy that people have put in this number 17. Actually, if you look at the work of Scott Onsalt, he looks at various megalithic sites around the world, various sites, and he sees these number structures written or encoded within structures in the positions of sites around the world. And he kind of doesn't necessarily think that's a conspiracy, that there's all these structures with all these important numbers around the world. He thinks that it's probably just the encoded message of the universe to say, hey, look here, look at this event or this site or whatever. So now moving on to Paul Craig Roberts. He's wrote an article onto his site called Sanctions and Airliners. First of all, his point is, I haven't brought up yet, the 9/11 plane that went down, not only at the Pentagon, but there was another plane elsewhere, a crash site, and they both fell at, and all these planes fell, about 30,000 feet, impacted and landed, but there was no debris around that site at 9/11. So I urge you to look into those, that information. But really what we want to look into is, why would the Russians take down a plane? And whose interests would it be? And why would the Ukrainian, or why would other interests, should I say, take down this plane? Because it doesn't have to be Ukrainian that takes down a plane. They can, but it quite possibly could be. You could look at the fact that apparently the rebels had two of the devices that they could possibly get hold of. This anti-ballistic missile system. They had two because they took them off the Ukrainian side. However, they couldn't have been trained, or they wasn't trained on how to use this properly. Now they only fired one shot, and apparently it hit the plane. Now if that was the case, it was 100% hit. Now if you're not properly trained on these things, why would you go about using it, especially on a commercial airline flight? It can't be a coincidence that they just let it off and it happened to hit the plane. You also have the flight paths of a plane, which I'll go into a bit later. So this information, Obama came out saying that it was the rebels. And so this was the Washington side of events. Now, we know that Washington lies. The US government lies, because they lied in Iraq with their weapons of mass destruction. They lied when they said Assad has used chemical weapons upon their own people. We know now that it was the rebels in that area. Ironically, they don't support rebels in Ukraine, but they support rebels in Syria, which are actually the same Al-Qaeda rebels that they are fighting against, or supposedly fighting against, in Iraq. And they're lying about the Iranian nukes. But interestingly enough, they're not they're lying about the interests in Israel, the Zionist interests in Israel, but the fact that Israel has many nukes within their reach. So, in whose interests? At the moment, Russia are offering assistance to the rebels, the Russian rebels, in Ukraine. And we've had this unprecedented build-up of propaganda in the mainstream media, totally demonising everything that the Russians have done, totally ignoring the fact that they are Russians themselves, and totally ignoring the history of Ukraine's relationship with Russia, and how and Kiev's relationship. So I urge you to just think in whose interests. Read this article by Paul Craig Roberts. It's too long for me to go into. But we move on to a different aspect. This is Sky News. Saying that there was a huge smell when the plane crashed of dead bodies. So, look into whether there was actually these dead bodies. Interestingly enough, there was a huge amount of AIDS researchers on this plane. Huge amount. In terms of the amount of people that were on board, the percentage, supposedly, they managed to exterminate whoever took this plane out. And funnily enough, when we look at flight manifesto of the other Malaysian plane that went down in March, I believe, 8th of March, there were some interesting figures on that plane that were exterminated. So you have these AIDS researchers. Now, according to this, there was this horrible smell of decayed bodies. But were these bodies actually fresh before the plane crashed? Were they alive before the plane crashed? Were they dead bodies from the AIDS research? Because we have this article here. I can't pronounce this guy's name. I'm not even going to pronounce it. That there were infected corpses on the ground after the flight. Decayed bodies on the ground. Now, this article is more slanted towards the idea that there is somebody out there that wants to inflict a virus upon people, biological warfare, and they want to inflict a virus upon the pro-Russian and inflict a virus upon the Russian people. This has been used before experimentally around the world. Biological warfare being used for centuries. For instance, I'll just get up an article here for you. The Red Cliff. I watched a film called Red Cliff. Oh no, it's a great film. And these guys used biological warfare in here. One of their bodies were infected by a disease, and what they decided to do was put their infected bodies onto a boat over to the other side of the river, the other side of the lake, whatever. I can't remember where it took place, and there they were forced to I think if they buried the dead, they didn't really know what to do, but the other side of the enemy were infected by the disease, so they made sure that both sides were infected, because otherwise if one side were infected they would have the upper hand and they could be attacked. So watch the film, you can see the biological warfare. It's based on a true story, one of the largest battles in human history. So we know that this has been done in history, and there's no reason why it can't be done today in terms of biologically being done. And funnily enough, you do see this unprecedented amount of films and TV programs where you have these zombies going around, and I do personally question whether somebody out there wants this zombie apocalypse. How it comes about, I have no idea. So looking at who is on the plane is important, and looking at what was on the plane was important. Were there dead bodies on the plane, and what kind of effect would those dead bodies, if they were infested with a virus, have? Because remember, they're not going to when they have the bodies, they're not going to burn them straight away. They're going to have to look at the bodies. Somebody's going to have to look at the bodies, and if they get infected by this disease, if there is a disease in there, it's likely that it could spread rapidly. And if these AIDS researchers were the only ones that knew that the bodies were infected with a disease, if this was highly classified information and they were using the plane as a transport to take to Thailand, this is all conjecture. I'm not basing this entirely on facts, but I just find it very interesting that there could have been dead bodies that were rotting already on the ground. These AIDS researchers went away, and so another aspect of this are the passports. We have seen pictures of passports which are completely intact. There isn't a scratch on them, and yet we see above here pictures of the plane crash, which looks like this. I can't seem to get that picture up. So you can see the plane crash is rather fast, and if there are passports, how comes they are so intact and yet the rest of the rest of the site is not? So kind of final point for this is that if you question this story, you'll be dubbed a conspiracy theorist. Now, of course, you have some crazy people out there who just immediately blame the Illuminati for everything. It's a case of they want to see a conspiracy. Now, I don't necessarily want to see a conspiracy. I just see the conspiracies around the world and how they interconnect. Then, using that information, I try and see whether the connections that I've made with conspiracies that I know already surrounding 9/11 and various other conspiracies. Yeah, don't want to get into those, and I see if there's a pattern, the same pattern, emerging into this. So, and what I want you to question is whether this is a distraction for what is going on in Israel and Gaza and Hamas. So consider that, and thank you very much.
We're joined now by Naftali Bennett. He's a member of Israel's Inner Security Cabinet. He's the Minister of Economy. Minister, thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening.
As we speak, we're just getting these reports, awful reports, 4 Palestinian kids playing on a beach, all of a sudden killed. An Israeli gunboat shell landed there. You've heard of these reports, right?
I just heard about it this moment. I think it's terrible that Hamas is butchering its own children. I would never take my children and place them next to missile launchers. Here's what they're doing. Hamas is conducting massive self-genocide. They're taking women and children, placing them next to missile launchers, and shooting the missiles at Israel.
But these kids apparently were playing on a beach.
I'm telling you, I'll tell you where we find the missile launchers. We find them in hospitals, in schools, in homes. I myself am a former commando fighter. I saw it in Lebanon. You have a kitchen, you have a living room, and then you have the missile launcher room. What they're deliberately doing is seeking to kill as many Palestinians as possible in order to yell to the world to help us. And this is cynical and cowardly. You know, if you want to conduct terror against Israelis, which is unacceptable, send fighters to do it. Don't send your women and children.
But they're not sending these are little children. They're just playing on the beach, and clearly the Israeli military was aiming for some sort of target, but in the process there was what they used to call at the Pentagon collateral damage. These are human beings that were...
Israel never targets civilians deliberately, period. What Israel does is defends itself. And when people shoot at us, just as you would do with your family, if someone's shooting at your family, you'll shoot back. If that coward is hiding behind his own children, they might get hit. This whole thing can go away in one moment. Hamas needs to do one thing: stop shooting.
The criticism is coming in from this organization, Human Rights Watch. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Israel's rhetoric, it says, is all about precision attacks, but attacks with no military target and many civilian deaths can hardly be considered price.
Look, taking radical left-wing organizations doesn't impress me. No one wants to save more lives than us. We want to save all lives. We want to live side by side. I'll remind you, we handed the entire Gaza Strip over to the Palestinians 9 years ago, back to the 67 lines, vacated all the settlements. They said they would turn it into Singapore of the Middle East. Instead, they invested billions in missile launchers, in tunnels, in TNT, and everything to kill people. We want to live peacefully side by side. The moment they stop shooting and disarm themselves, we stop at that very moment.